Okay, welcome back everyone to Revolution, Socialism, and Global Conflict, the Rise and Fall of World Communism. And here we will sum up this chapter with the paths to the end of communism. Okay. Now the communist era ended rapidly and peacefully between the late 1970s and 1991. China, their leader Mao Zedong, died in 1976. In Europe, most of the popular movements overthrew their communist governments by 1989. In both cases show an economic failure of communism. The communist states couldn't catch up economically. The Soviet economy was stagnant, wasn't going anywhere, and failures were known around the world. That wasn't kept quiet. And the economic failure limited their military capacity. Now, both cases show the moral failure of communism, Stalin's terror and the Gulag. For example, Mao's Cultural Revolution, near genocide in Cambodia, with Pol Pot. And it all happened in a global climate that embraced democracy and human rights. Let's start with China. They're abandoning communism and maintaining the party. This is a very interesting case here. In 1976, Deng Xiaoping came to power. He relaxed censorship in China, released about 100,000 political prisoners, and even dismantled the collectivized farming system that they had developed. So after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, Deng Xiaoping engaged in a series of reforms that first loosened up on culture and then addressed the abuses of the Cultural Revolution before opening up the economy. So the question is this really Mao's worst fears? These economic reforms revolutionized the Chinese economy by moving away from state control and allowing small-scale private enterprise to flourish. And while the state supervised the process, it seemed as if Mao's worst fears had come true as China went down the path towards capitalism. And while the economy boomed, wealth inequalities became more and more intense and social vices returned to the cities. And so China is now opening itself up to the world economy. And as the result is this stunning economic growth and new prosperity. But also generated, along with the intense wealth inequalities, that opened up for massive corruption among officials, urban inequality, pollution, and inequality between the coast and the interior of China. Now, the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, has kept its political monopoly, ironically enough. Brutal crushing of a democracy movement in the late 1980s. And there's also the Tiananmen Square massacre. And that sent a very interesting message in 1989. As the party loosened up on the economy, a student movement called for political freedoms as well, and even democracy. And Deng Xiaoping made it very clear that there would be no discussion of democracy and crushed the student movement in front of an international press and their cameras in June of 1989. So while China moved away from communist economic policies and embraced capitalist growth, the CCP remained firmly in control and tolerated no dissent as it entered the 21st century. They really wanted to maintain their strange and troubled hybrid that combined nationalism with consumerism and this new respect for ancient traditions. So let's talk about this image. So what does this image show and where does it come from? Well, this is a poster from China showing traditional gods of wealth on top, for example. Happiness, right, the lower left. Longevity, the lower right. And the caption reads, "The gods of wealth enter the home from everywhere." And below the gods are two children carrying a golden pot, topped with stacks of paper currency, brightly colored flowers against a sparkling blue background that really add to the image's cheery and happy atmosphere. Now see if you can date this poster. Just think about it. What time period in Chinese history does it reflect? This is a 1993 New Year's Eve poster. It's difficult to imagine such a poster being distributed in China prior to Mao's death in 1976. And the embrace of wealth and prosperity as personal goals were not part of the communist ideology. And that encompassed selflessness, simplicity, community, and it would not have included a reference to paper currency in the pre-revolutionary dynasties. It was the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, who came to power, that preserved the hold of the Communist Party in China while largely abandoning communism as an economic practice. So here we see the difference between communism as an economy and communism as a political system. So in this poster, I want you to think about this. Is it simply a return to traditional Chinese culture? What about this image is anything but traditional? Do you see both? So although the poster, by all appearances, embraces Chinese traditional values and customs, you can see that throughout the entire image, it is centered on a novel and foreign object, paper currency. One stack of notes carries the silhouette of 4 men. This is most likely China's currency. But there's also a stack of US dollars. Right? The silhouette of George Washington is visible on the center of that top bill. And that's very interesting. Okay, the Soviet Union and their collapse of communism and country. Okay, so Mikhail Gorbachev became the general secretary in the mid-1980s. And he launched an economic reform program called Perestroika, or restructuring, in 1987. And there's also the glasnost, or openness, to greater cultural and intellectual freedoms. And glasnost revealed what a huge mess the Soviet Union was. Crime, prostitution, suicide, corruption was rampant. So now we have Mikhail Gorbachev's Perestroika and glasnost. And the failure of the late Soviet economy was a great embarrassment to a party that claimed to make the material lives of its people better. And this last Soviet leader tried to save communism by reforming from within. And he started with allowing an economic restructuring, that's Perestroika, and then moved on to a policy of openness, the glasnost. However, Russian farmers were unwilling to engage in economic ventures as their Chinese counterparts had, and he failed to attract foreign investment. Thus, Gorbachev's reforms resulted in an economic downturn and allowed protesters to criticize the government. And during these reforms and this, and seeing all the problems that the Soviets had with corruption and prostitution and crime, it really showed the extent of Stalin's atrocities as they were uncovered. And this new openness to religious expression became a large part of these reforms and ending government censorship of their culture. And that led to some democratization and free elections in 1989. And there was a move to end the Cold War by making unilateral military cuts, negotiating arms controls with the United States. But Gorbachev's reforms actually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So now these new nationalist movements make matters worse. Many of the regional minorities demanded autonomy or independence from what they saw as Russian as opposed to communist domination. And Gorbachev refused to use force against these movements, and that led to the collapse of the regimes in Eastern Europe. And in 1989 is sometimes known as a miracle year. So after the crushing of the student movement in China, a series of protests and revolts toppled the Eastern European communist regimes in the space of a few weeks. And importantly, the USSR did not move to prop up these unpopular regimes. And the Soviet Union becomes Russia and 14 other states in 1991. And as protests grew and a coup failed, the Soviet Union peacefully voted itself out of existence in December of 1991. And suddenly, the first communist state no longer existed, and the party quickly became inconsequential. So, Gorbachev's reforms led to the collapse. The planned economy was dismantled, and a market-based system could develop. New freedoms led to more strident demands. These subordinate states demanded autonomy, and Gorbachev refused to use force to crush the protesters, and these Eastern European states then break free from this Soviet-sponsored form of communism. Conservatives actually attempted a coup in 1991, but 14 new and independent states emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union. So 14 independent states, and then Russia would make 15. And by 2000, the communist world had shrunk considerably. Communism had lost its dominance completely in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. China had mostly abandoned communist economic policies. Vietnam and Laos remained officially communist but pursued Chinese-style reforms. Cuba. The economic crisis in the 1990s began to allow small businesses, private food markets, and even tourism. So these industries could grow. And North Korea is the most unreformed and Stalinist communist state that remains. And a lot of international tensions remain only in East Asia and the Caribbean. And that takes us to what became of the European map, or at least the Eastern European map, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we have the former Soviet Union, all that's there in green, and in orange, the former communist-controlled states of East Europe. So they were still their own countries, right? Like we talked about earlier with Eastern Germany and Poland, the Czech Republic, you have Slovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, which now consists mainly of Serbia. These were all those satellite countries that existed before. And Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all gained their autonomy after the fall of the Soviet Union as well. Okay, guys, that sums up revolution, socialism, and global conflict as we finished up paths to an end of communism. I'll see you again for reflections. We're going to look at judging or not to judge.